Hello and welcome to a quick walkthrough of Card as it is of now. Mainly for the benefit of Malcolm, who has been away for 2 weeks, but also if you're wanting to get started with Card, I will go over some very quick setup instructions. I have some personal config which is git ignored away, but you can copy it if you want or find another way. I use direnv to set the site base URI, so I have an env-rc file which just sets it to home.jux.site. You can also run site locally and set it to your local site instance if you want. I also have, if we have a look here, an init script. I made an example one just to show you. All it does is gets my token. Obviously it's got my actual username and password, which you can get from, I don't know, Malcolm or someone. So if I run init, then it will get my token, store it and it's valid for an hour. Now, running site, slight changes since 2 weeks ago. There are two different ways of running it. You can run both at the same time. One is Storybook and one is the ClojureScript app. So the ClojureScript app has everything, all of the reframe stuff, obviously actually fetching from the site API or the logic, that sort of thing. Whereas Storybook is purely the UI components. Speaking of the UI components, this is our people file. One change you might notice is that we've moved them. So now we have the structure is source and CLJS for the CLJS, CSS for the CSS, and you'll never guess what's in JS. It's TypeScript. So I changed from JSX files to TSX files because there were some really annoying things that happen when you just use plain JavaScript that TypeScript saves you from. It is like a little bit of a learning curve to learn what half of the syntax means, because you have things like these types, obviously. A lot of them are inferred, sort of auto-generated by the editor, and like that is why I'm using VS Code for the TypeScript stuff, because writing out all of this boilerplate every time would be a bit painful. And there's another reason, and another thing you may have noticed, this people file was like 1,000 lines long before, and now it's much shorter. And that's because I went through, and if you select a component in VS Code, you can extract it into a thing. So this, what is this? Menu bar. If I type that, then you'll see it's extracted it and it's got all the props passed in. And then I can go and see it here, and I can even move it to a new file as well if I wanted to. And it just, imports it, sets that all up. And now this is a new file. And I've done that with a few of these things, and it helps a lot with navigating around and readability. Obviously you'll see that this props is annoyed at me or TypeScript's annoyed at me because props has an any type implicitly. We haven't specified what props is, and that means that when I'm doing things to props, it's not sure what's going on. So it's ideal to infer the types like that, and it will just auto-generate it, and then you can correct it. And there are some reusable types that we have in a types file here. So things like the user, which is passed in multiple places, navigation item, sidebar props, the form data for the calendar. These things are used in multiple places, and I extracted it in a similar way to extracting those view components. What else is there to go through? Yeah, I will go through Storyboard first. So you can either do it from your terminal by typing in npm run storyboard, or you can do it from VS Code's build thing. So Storyboard takes a bit to start up, and then it will open up in the browser here. So we can see that we have different components. I haven't made a story for every component because it didn't seem necessary to do it for a lot of them. You can see that only some of these have .stories files. So to make a story, we can try making one for something simple. Let's say this directory list. If we wanted to make a story for this, we can make a new file, directory list.stories, and then look at another story. For example, this calendar one. Basically all it is exporting a default object. You got a title, where it's namespaced with the category. So we have people and then everything under it. In the future, I guess we'll have Kanban and card and other things too. The component, which we import and just give it there, and that's the thing that actually gets rendered. And then parameters is for storyboard actions. So an action is a mocked out handler for any event props that are passed in. Because all of our handlers come from ClojureScript, we don't have them in Storybook. So if I was to do something like add an event, then nothing is actually going to happen because ClojureScript handles putting the event into sight. But because we have this on star regex, which binds any prop that starts with on into an action, Storybook has picked that up and it has logged that on update event was called with these props. So this is useful for testing if we ever add tests later on, and also just for clicking around and making sure that your forms are set up with doing the right props. And then this stuff here is optional, but it's for specifying the different forms that your components can take. In this case, we have the regular calendar and it's got these props here, and there's a calendar with no events and it's got no events and is current user is set to false, and that's just to check that we can't edit the calendar of someone else. And you can see that we have extracted some things like these mock events into the utils file, just because this is used in multiple places. To replicate this, all we need to do is copy and paste some of this, and then we can just change our imports and just do a find and replace here for calendar, changing it to directory list, and fix up some of these things. And this won't actually take any actions yet, but we can leave this in there and it won't mess with anything. Fix this, and then just change the props to reflect what it needs to. So in this case, a directory list, we can see it just takes a directory key, and a directory item is just a map with a value of a user array. So we can mock up a directory list. If we look in people stories, you'll see we already have this directory, which we can extract, update the imports here, and update the args here. We can see that there are no red lines. We're probably good. Let's check our stories. We've got this directory list and it's not here because I think it hides. Yeah, okay. A directory list is hidden when the screen is too small. I mean, it's not the most ideal use case for a story, but we can at least test all of the local state stuff works. And if we were to develop on that, we can change the size of this, and then we can play around with the actual directory file itself. If we wanted to change any of these styles, we can see what they are, and I don't know, let's say we want to change this text, hello, you can see it re-renders. But importantly, and this is something that doesn't happen in ClojureScript, if I was to, you know, be in some altered state with these local hooks, changing things will not upset the state. It's also a lot quicker. You'll see in a minute when I show you the ClojureScript stuff. ClojureScript can take 2 or 3 seconds to hot reload, where this is usually half a second or so, and this will always be half a second, because with ClojureScript it has more things to compile the more files you add, but this is only doing one story at a time. So I think it's quite a nice thing to be able to just run this, and you don't have to run a JVM or Clojure, and you can just play with the UI components. So the local state stuff, obviously a lot of the Tailwind UI components come with their own hooks, but I found that not all of them do. Like this search thing wasn't hooked up at all. Yeah, here I'm just using this useState hook. It takes a default value and then it gives you the, I guess, getter and setter sort of thing, but it's functional. So this search text is a const, and this will just re-render a lot like an atom would, but instead of using swap on an atom, they give you the function that you use to swap it. So this set search text is a function that takes a string, and we can see that we use it on change of this input, and then that will update the value of search text, and then search text can be used here to filter out our list of people. So I think that is most of what I want to show in the JavaScript world. Oh, one more thing is just the calendar form. So if we look at our calendar, this is by far the most complicated UI component we have. We have the ability to click to add an event. We can also select a range of days to add a range. We can enter something, and when we submit, you'll see the action. We get the description, the start, the end, and we also have these other views, day and week, and on these other views we can set timed events. So these aren't all-day events, these are from a start time to an end time. We can obviously convert it to an all-day if we wanted to. And once you've created an event like this all-day one, you can move it around, you can drag it, and all of these events will dispatch on update event with the new event to be updated. To do this form, oh yeah, there's also an edit and delete thing for doing that. So to do this form though, I decided to use local state to handle these events and also to do the validation. It could maybe be done in ClojureScript, but I think it would get quite complicated and you'd have to go back and forth a lot. And it's quite nice to just be able to develop this component independently of everything else. So just to go over how this form works and how you should do a form if you ever need to, we have the calendar component itself, which has some state that's used by this full calendar component. This has a bunch of handlers, and I won't go into too much detail about how this is set up, but it's mainly from copying their documentation. But the form itself, when you click on an event, you get this modal pop up, and you'll see that we have modal props and set modal props, which is of this type, calendar modal props, and this is obviously null by default when there is no modal open. And then when we click on an event, this handle select thing is called, and that will set modal props to the start date, end date, all day, and any other props that is passed from the full calendar library when you click on an event. When set modal props is called, this modal props now has a value. You can see we render this create event form at the top here, and we pass it modal props and the on update event handler, which is passed in from our ClojureScript. This create event form component is our modal, and you can see that we have the props here defined as the range, which is the modal props, set range, which is that set modal props, and then our on submit. And we are using this React hook form library to handle the form state. So unlike pretty much every other form library that you see in the React world, like the older ones that were before hooks, this doesn't rely on having an on-change handler that on every key press re-renders the component. So when I'm typing in here, this isn't actually changing the state of anything. It only looks at the form when action is done, or when there's an error, it will look when I type to see if that error still exists. But it's quite an efficient way, and from a user point of view, all you need to do to add an input and have it add into this state is use this register function that is returned from the hook, and you just give it the name of the field and then pass it into an input. So here we map over this array which is just a way of abstracting the fact that every input here has a label and it has an error message and it has an input of this width and these styles and that sort of thing. And if there's an error, we'll render it, otherwise we'll just show the label and all that good stuff. Just going to show how easy it is to add like another field. So if I wanted to add a name field, then I could copy this one, change description to name, change this label to. Now if I save this, even though I have these red squiggly lines, you'll see that I get the name field and it looks like all the other fields, and I can type stuff in, click save, and you'll see that my name is passed in. So this would just start working. The reason I get these squiggly lines is because of TypeScript. It's only expecting these keys and we have an extra one. So to satisfy that, we can go to see our form inputs is expecting this calendar form data, and we could add name as a string, and we could say what type it is, if it's required or not. And once we do that, this will stop complaining because now it knows that input name can be a name. If I try and add some validation for that name thing, I can go into this and it will work with my validation and be able to auto-complete the fact that this is a string and all that sort of thing. So there are definitely like quite a lot of advantages I found with taking like the little bit of time to specify the types. And as I said, a lot of it is, especially these props, can be inferred by the TypeScript tooling. So that is it in terms of JavaScript. Always good to clean out these unused imports because every import will add to the bundle size. So let's switch over to developing the closure part of it. To do that, we just need to do npm run dev, and that will start our CSS for doing Tailwind, Babel for compiling these TypeScript files into a form that Shadow can import, and Shadow itself for compiling the closure script. And now that's done, we can find our Emacs and bring this over here and go to 8000. So you will see here that we have our same components that you saw in Storybook. You'll see it's updated with my new name field here, and I can of course change things in my JavaScript files. So if I was to remove that name stuff, then it will eventually update, but as you can see it ruins all of the state because the ClojureScript compiler isn't smart enough to know what the React components are doing. But you can definitely edit the UI from the ClojureScript build. It's not like you have to use Storybook. But if we're wanting to do anything with the site data, then you will need to use ClojureScript, and you can see here that my holidays have been fetched. So in our nav, in navigation.cljs, I did a refactoring just to make this a bit clearer. We now have these pages definition. If one of them has a label, then that's how we know to render it as an item here. I could delete that and this would go away. And it will also have an optional FX key which defines any reframe effects that we want to dispatch when this view is mounted. So when I go to cards, all cards here, it's going to dispatch get cards. When I go to people, it's going to do get people and get holidays. And that's how I have my holidays here. You'll see if I add a new holiday, then my holiday gets added here and I can delete it like this. So we're not actually doing anything clever in the JavaScript files to manage this state. Instead, when you do a change, the JavaScript just calls handle update event, which is passed in our people CLJS file. We've got onUpdate and onDelete. OnUpdate does update event, and onDelete does delete entity. These entity dispatch functions, by the way, I added a optional second argument, which is a fx handler to dispatch after success. So if we go to delete entity, then we can see on success, we do whatever we're doing, and then we also pass in the fx, which will get run on success. All we did for our update holidays is we have update event, because possibly there'll be timesheets as well as holidays, and it takes in the props that we saw in Storybook, so that JS map object, which we convert to CLJ, and then we do put holiday, which just creates our crux document and then inserts it into site using our Open API holidays put operation that we have defined here. I've gone over that very quickly, I think, but hopefully you should get the idea of how easy it is now to add stuff. Hopefully easy. And yeah, so obviously there's some things that don't work yet. This filter thing, pretty much all of this stuff, all of these links here, and you know, the search works, but there's still a lot of mocked out data, and you can see some of the data is just incorrect, like birthday, and I think this is fine, but I think Juxt must have the wrong salary on their end, so things to update in both places, as you can see. Anyway, I think that is it. So goodbye.